What's up, my Canadian cousins, my very good friends? So, I have been getting a lot of questions, reoccurring questions in the comments, and the most often asked one is, what has made me so interested in Canada and Canadian culture and history? And that's a very good question, and one I think deserves an answer. So instead of just trying to respond to those comments individually, I thought I would answer it here. And I also thought that, well, there may be other things that you all want to know or are curious about. And, if so, you can certainly post questions in the comments to this video. And if there are enough of them, I will do a video in which I answer, I'll take a sampling of the questions depending on how many there are, and I'll endeavor to answer them. So, why am I interested in Canada, and why am I doing this? Well, if you've been watching from the beginning, I probably said this a few times, that I was a history major in college, but my interest in history and in world affairs goes way back to when I was a little kid. I just always liked to watch the news and to see what was going on in the world. I was a really young boy when the Iran hostage crisis happened, and I was riveted by it and concerned by it. When I started learning about American history, U.S. history, it really begins as a little kid, as we learn about certain simple things like the age of exploration, Christopher Columbus, who, we now don't glorify anymore because he was a horrible human being, but nevertheless, he did rediscover the Americas for Europe. Henry Hudson, which, you all know very well. We have the Hudson River, you have Hudson Bay, his exploration, John Cabot, who was also part of your history. And so, learning about colonial America was always something that was very fascinating to me, and so was ultimately our Revolutionary War. So, learning from a very early age that I speak a language that is English, that I can understand people from the mother country, really sunk into me that, well, we are derived from this other country. And although we became independent many years, many hundreds of years ago, 1776 to be precise, it wasn't so simple. Even when the Revolutionary War started, the Continental Congress did try to make up with Britain, and it wasn't until later, and Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, really started to convince many of the masses that independence was the way to go. Of course, there were a lot of loyalists, and a lot of them ended up in Canada. And so there, right off the bat, there's sort of this shared history of European colonization of North America, and the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, is part of our shared history. And certainly, to some extent, the American Revolution is part of our shared history. But, my fascination with Britain was sort of in the forefront because I understood that to be our parent country. And so, also knowing, growing up during the end of the Cold War, that the term special relationship with Great Britain and the United Kingdom was thrown about so much, and Margaret Thatcher was very much, in the fray and in the news, and part of the attempt to have peace negotiations through being tough, along with Ronald Reagan, was certainly something that I knew about. I also was aware that Canada's Prime Minister was in there at some, in some respects, Prime Minister Mulroney. I did know his name. I did know what he looked like. But, in the United States, it's really, there's this weird fascination with the mother country, even though we separated from them for so long. And that continues today to some extent. A lot of people are fascinated with the British royalty, even though we, wouldn't want monarchy, but yet there's this strange fascination we have. And that's sort of always been the case. And it seemed inevitable that the United States and the UK would come back together and have, forge trade, cultural, and foreign policy relationship and the alliances that we did forge, ultimately, particularly after the World Wars, and especially after World War II, and continuing to this day. So when I went to college, I studied history, and at some point you have to narrow your focus because, becoming an expert in any particular branch of history is extremely difficult to do. I did begin to focus on Western Europe and especially the UK. And Canada's always there, especially as it relates to the UK. You're part of the Commonwealth, and of course, gradually gain your independence from the United Kingdom. Still part of the constitutional monarchy and Commonwealth. And so it's always been in my mind that, Canada was part of all of that. And I knew a lot about Canada's participation in the world wars. But what I really didn't know was about a lot of the domestic political history and otherwise in Canada post the War of 1812. I also thought, like a lot of Americans do, that we know you pretty well. I didn't assume that Canadians were the same as Americans. I assumed that there were similarities in our cultures, and I still believe that. But I knew there were differences, and I've visited Canada several times. I've had Canadian friends here, but unless you really do a deep exploration into Canadian history and culture, you don't really understand. It's easy to make the assumption because your accents are very similar to ours, and culturally you're very similar to us in a lot of ways, that you are more the same than you actually are, and that you have these interesting and wonderful distinctions. Americans, of a particular moral ilk or political ilk, I don't want to make this political though, does look to Canada with admiration over certain of your progressive policies. We look to Canada sometimes with curiosity and with lack of understanding about what exactly is the deal with Quebec and Quebec's, at certain times movements towards becoming their own sovereign nation, without really understanding a lot more about it. And so when I started this channel, I had really come to enjoy watching YouTube history videos and people from other English-speaking countries react to American history and American culture. And I thought, well, I want to do that with the children, with our cousins out there in the children of the British Empire. But I can't bite off more than I can chew, and I was a bit naive, and so I started off with wanting to know more about Australia, more about New Zealand, include the United Kingdom in there, although again I've studied UK culture and history far more than anyone else, and of course Canada. But as I quickly came to realize as I was doing these reactions, my interest steered towards Canada more than anywhere else, because I realized that I didn't know what I didn't know. I made an assumption that I knew and understood you better than I actually did. And I found it very enriching to take a deeper dive into the country. To me, out of all of those, and no offense to any of those other countries, they're wonderful, you're really the most important to us. The UK is very important in our historical and strategic alliances in Europe and NATO, but you're really the most important to us. You are our best friends. You are our neighbors. You are one of our greatest trading partners. We've had this wonderful strategic alliance as well. You've done things for us. You've been there for us when we've needed you. I did the video about 9/11, and I mentioned the Iran hostage crisis and what Ken Taylor and the embassy staff did for us. And I want to do a specific reaction video on that, because I understand that the movie Argo didn't do it justice. Um, and I really decided that this is the most important national relationship that we have with anyone else, and I've been remiss on behalf of all of my fellow Americans. We are somewhat remiss, and it's not because we're disinterested. I think I was, maybe better than the common American about it, just because of my, interest in history and world affairs. But I think, a lot of Americans, it's not that they're disinterested in Canada. Most people like Canada and believe that Canadians are, if you ask them, they'll probably tell you Canadians are polite, Canadians are nice, Canadians are good neighbors, which is true, but it's superficial, and I can understand why you guys get a little annoyed that, they don't try to understand you better. I think for a lot of Americans, it's because they already think they know you well. They kind of think that, you're more like us than you are, and they think that, you're just this other version of America that sits further north where it's cold, which is that is born of ignorance, and it's a false assumption. But I think it isn't malicious, and there is no intent to ignore you guys. As for me, I've just found that this has been a very rewarding process, and I've kind of gone into a rabbit hole, because the more I learn and the more I have these wonderful connections and conversations with you guys, the more suggestions I get, on related topics, and the more I'm weaving in and out of the fabric of your culture and history. And I've learned a ton, and I think I understand you a lot better. And I know you're not a monolithic, society, so I'm not making an assumption that you're all the same. I know you're not. I know different regions have different, priorities and mentalities. And, nevertheless, I do feel like just in the short 4 or 5 months I've been doing this, I've come to understand you so much better, come to respect and admire you even more than I did before. And I'm looking at everything, I'm not looking at it through rose-colored glasses necessarily. I'm looking at warts and all. But I do see, a very close relation to us that I want to be related to, that I want to be friends with, that I want as my neighbor, and that I want to understand. Even before I started this channel, there have been a few Canadian YouTubers that I were watching. One of them is JJ McCullough. I do understand he can be somewhat controversial in Canada sometimes. I do think he is helped me understand your culture somewhat, and he's willing to look at warts and all, but he also, I think understands Americans pretty well too, which I like. But I don't always agree with him, and I can understand why he rubs some people the wrong way. I think he's actually been denounced in the Quebec Parliament. But nevertheless, it's all well and good. I can watch JJ McCullough. I could watch other YouTubers. As a small YouTube history channel called A Few Acres of Snow, and I actually now understand where that term comes from. And he's very wonderful, and I like his material too. But if I do the reactions, and I then, as a direct result of the reactions, have the dialogue directly with all of you and see the conversations that you have with one another, to me, that's the best way to learn. And it's just been very rewarding, and I've been blown away by the vast majority of the responses have been just amazingly positive, which motivates me to continue to do this. Yes, there has been a few people that have been, it's the internet, quite unkind, but really, really, really minuscule percentage of most of all of you guys. So I hope that answers the question. I'm, nowhere near done. And I feel a little bad I'm neglecting those other countries, but you know what? This is more important to me right now. I will get to some reactions over there sooner rather than later, but I'm going to continue to do the majority of my journey on Canada for the foreseeable future. All right, guys. So look, I've spent like 15 minutes on that. I hope I didn't bore you and up too much. Let me know in the comments whether or not you are interested in my doing a video answering additional questions. And if you are, post some questions, and I'll see if there's a good enough response. I'll do it. Other than that, my friends, have a wonderful, wonderful day or evening or morning or whatever time of day you're watching this, and I will see you soon. Peace, my friends.